There is a document that exists, not in the realm of theory or rumour or whispered speculation, but in the cold clinical archives of the United States government. A real document, typed on real paper, stamped with real classification markings, bearing the real signatures of real men who held real power over the fate of millions. It was drafted in the early spring of 1962, reviewed by the highest military officers in the country, and presented to the Secretary of Defense in the offices of the Pentagon. It proposed things that, when you read them now, feel more like the opening pages of a political thriller than the official minutes of a government meeting. It proposed staging attacks, manufacturing incidents, engineering provocations so convincing, so seamlessly constructed, that the American public would believe the nation was under siege. And then, riding the wave of outrage that would inevitably follow, the United States military would have its justification to do what it had already decided it wanted to do. The document was called Operation Northwoods. It was rejected. President John F. Kennedy looked at it, and he said no. The plan was buried, sealed away, and classified for decades. When it finally saw daylight, released under the Freedom of Information Act in the 1990s, it landed not with a thunderclap, but with a quiet, unsettling thud. Most people who read about it felt the same creeping sensation. Not shock exactly, but a kind of verification. A confirmation that the world they had always half suspected might be true was, at least in part, exactly as dark as they feared. But here is the question that has never fully gone away. If something like this could be formally proposed once, drafted in official language, reviewed by official hands, passed up the chain of official command, what happened to the idea after the rejection? Did it die with the signature that refused it? Did the concept of using manufactured reality as a foreign policy tool simply evaporate because one president said no? Or did it evolve? Tonight, we are going to follow a thread. We are going to begin with what is real and documented, trace it through what is theorized and argued, and arrive somewhere that you will need to sit with for a while. We are going to look at the story of a man named Daniel Voss, a policy analyst who became consumed by a pattern he could not explain and could not ignore. His story is fictional, the documents he studies are not. The questions he asks are ones that serious researchers have been asking for decades. Get comfortable, take a breath. Let the weight of the day begin to loosen its grip on your shoulders. This is the Northwoods Protocol, Act 1, the document that should have ended it. To understand why Operation Northwoods matters, not just as a historical footnote, but as a kind of philosophical earthquake for anyone who studies intelligence and power, you need to understand the world it was born into. 1962. The Cold War is not an abstraction. It is a living, breathing, daily terror. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. Cuba, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, has just survived an American-backed invasion attempt. The Bay of Pigs, and emerged from it with Fidel Castro more entrenched than ever, and a newly cemented relationship with Moscow. The United States government is furious, embarrassed, and desperate. There is a genuine fear that Cuba could become a Soviet staging ground, a base for missiles or for influence operations across Latin America. The pressure to do something, anything, is enormous. And so, in the early months of 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized the drafting of a classified memorandum. The document is formally titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. It is signed by General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and what it contains, laid out in the careful, bureaucratic language of mid-century military planning, is a series of proposals for what are called pretexts, manufactured reasons that could be used to justify an American military attack on Cuba. The proposals are staggering in their detail and their cynicism. One suggestion involves staging a fake attack on the American naval base at Guantanamo Bay. American soldiers, dressed in Cuban military uniforms, would conduct a simulated assault on the base. Fake funerals would be held for fake casualties. The media would be invited to cover the aftermath, and America would have its casus belli. Another proposal involves a civilian aircraft. A real commercial flight would be replaced secretly by a drone, an unmanned aircraft painted to look identical to the passenger plane. The drone would be flown over Cuban airspace and then remotely destroyed, with a radio transmission sent out beforehand in the voice of the aircraft's fictitious pilot, claiming that the plane was under attack by Cuban military jets. The wreckage would fall into the sea, and America would have its casus belli. There is a proposal involving the sinking of a ship. designed to echo the sinking of the USS Maine in 1898, the event that triggered the Spanish-American War. There are proposals for bombings in American cities, dressed up to look like Cuban terrorism. There are proposals for harassment campaigns against Cuban refugees living in Miami, designed to generate outrage. There are proposals involving the shooting down of military aircraft, the mining of harbours, the orchestration of entire fictional crises, each one built to produce a single outcome: American public support for military action against Cuba. The document is presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in March of 1962. Kennedy rejects it, completely and immediately. He is reportedly furious. General Lemnitzer is quietly reassigned not long afterward. The document is locked away. And officially Operation Northwoods ends there. A bad idea proposed by men who were desperate and afraid, rejected by a president with the moral clarity to say no. But here is where the story refuses to stay tidy. The document does not vanish, it sits in the archives, and when it finally surfaces in the 1990s, declassified in the wake of the Assassination Records Collection Act, which was itself prompted by Oliver Stone's film about the Kennedy assassination, it does not read like a relic. It reads like a blueprint that, once drawn, cannot be undrawn, a set of ideas that, once articulated clearly enough to survive in a filing cabinet for 3 decades, cannot simply be wished out of existence. Because the men who read this document, not just McNamara and Kennedy, but the generals and intelligence officers and strategic planners who drafted it, reviewed it, discussed it in conference rooms and over telephone lines, those men did not simply forget what they had written. They understood something that most of the public would not grasp for decades, that the most powerful weapon in a modern conflict is not a missile or a tank or a naval fleet. It is a story, a narrative, a version of events that is delivered to a population with such speed and such apparent authority that questioning it feels not just wrong but unpatriotic, unhinged, even dangerous. Operation Northwoods was, at its core, a theory of narrative warfare. It understood that you did not need to win on the battlefield if you could win in the mind first, and that understanding did not go away with the rejection. Act 2. The Analyst. Daniel Voss is the kind of man who exists in every major research institution in Washington, D.C., but is noticed by almost no one. He's in his early 40s. He has spent his career in the quiet corridors of policy analysis, reading declassified documents, writing reports that are read by perhaps 30 people, attending conferences where the most exciting moment is usually an argument over footnotes. He's not dramatic. He's not particularly charismatic. He's methodical, careful, and possessed of the kind of patience that most people can only sustain for about an hour before reaching for their phone. He's been studying Cold War intelligence doctrine for 15 years when he first encounters Operation Northwoods, not as a conspiracy theory but as a primary source. He reads the original document. He reads the contemporaneous memos surrounding it. He reads the accounts of the people who were in those rooms, and then he does what good analysts do. He puts it in context. He files it properly in his mental architecture of the era, another data point, another piece of evidence about how desperate and strange and morally compromised the Cold War environment really was. And then he moves on, except that something about it keeps snagging in him. Not the specific proposals, those are shocking certainly, but they also feel very much of their time, the product of a particular moment of geopolitical crisis and institutional panic. What snags in Voss is the underlying logic, the principle, the recognition that a government body, a real one, functioning normally in every other respect, had sat down and thought carefully, methodically, seriously about the question, how do we manufacture reality convincingly enough to change what people believe? That question, he begins to realise, does not have an expiration date. He starts pulling threads. He begins building what he privately calls a cross-temporal archive, a collection of documents, reports, and analyses spanning from the early 1960s to the present day, organised not by date or by geography, but by a single criterion: the degree to which the event in question appears to involve the deliberate shaping of public narrative by actors with access to institutional power. At first, the archive is small, a few dozen items, documented cases of media manipulation during the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, which revealed that the government had been systematically lying to the public about the war's progress for years, COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret program to monitor, infiltrate and discredit civil rights organisations, peace groups and political dissidents. The Church Committee hearings of the mid-1970s, which exposed a cascade of covert programs that most Americans had no idea existed. Assassination plots against foreign leaders, domestic surveillance operations, propaganda campaigns aimed at American citizens. Each of these is well documented, well studied. Individually, they are understood as products of specific historical circumstances, moments of institutional overreach that have since been corrected, contained, reformed. The standard narrative is, we learned from these mistakes. We put safeguards in place. We would not do this again. But Voss is not looking at individual trees. He is trying to see the forest. And the more he looks at the forest, the more he notices something that refuses to be explained away by the standard narrative. The logic that produced Operation Northwoods did not just survive its rejection. It became more sophisticated, more patient, more invisible. He starts paying attention not to the events themselves, but to the space around them, the timing, the sequence, the speed at which certain narratives form and certain interpretations are foreclosed. He notices that in the hours and days after major geopolitical events, there is frequently a period, sometimes as short as 48 hours, sometimes a few days, in which the dominant interpretation of what happened crystallizes into something remarkably stable. Competing explanations that might seem equally plausible are not simply debated and then resolved through the accumulation of evidence. They are often foreclosed, made socially and politically unacceptable before the evidence is even in. He starts keeping notes, long, careful, obsessively cross-referenced notes, and slowly the pattern begins to speak. Act 3. The theory emerges. There is a moment in certain kinds of research when you realise you're no longer studying the thing you set out to study. You think you're pulling a thread, and then you realise the thread is attached to something much larger than the fabric you were examining. This is the moment Voss reaches in the second year of his cross-temporal archive project. He's not looking for a grand unified theory of power and deception. He's looking for patterns in historical intelligence operations. And then, one afternoon, in his office, in Washington, D.C., surrounded by printouts and open windows of declassified documents and a coffee that has been sitting cold for 3 hours, he sees it. Not a single event, not a single program, a shape. The shape repeats, across decades, across administrations, across geographic contexts, across ideological divides. It repeats with the kind of regularity that, once you have seen it, becomes impossible to unsee. The shape is this, a moment of tension or crisis, sometimes genuine, sometimes ambiguous, followed by a rapid, coordinated crystallization of narrative across media and government simultaneously, followed by a foreclosure of alternative interpretations, followed by a policy decision that had apparently been contemplated before the triggering event occurred, followed by a long-term structural consequence that benefits certain institutional interests. This is not a theory about any single event. Voss is very careful about that. He is not claiming that any particular moment in modern history was staged or manufactured. He is noticing something more subtle and in some ways more disturbing. The machinery that responds to events appears to operate on timescales, and with levels of coordination that would be extraordinary if they were truly spontaneous. If the responses are improvised, they are improvised with a speed and coherence that should be humanly impossible. And if they are not improvised, if they are in some meaningful sense prepared, then what does that mean about the relationship between the events and the responses? He calls his first draft of this observation the evolution hypothesis. The central claim is simple. Operation Northwoods was not a one-time proposal. It was the articulation of a principle, the principle that controlling the narrative of an event is more powerful than controlling the event itself. And that principle did not die in 1962. It survived. It was refined. It was institutionalized. Not in any single program, not through any single conspiracy, but as a way of thinking about power that gradually permeated certain institutional cultures and became, over time, as automatic and as invisible as the air in the room. The evolution, as Voss traces it, moves through several stages. The first stage is the Cold War era itself, the period when programs like COINTELPRO and Operations Chaos and Mockingbird demonstrated that American institutions were willing and able to conduct sophisticated narrative operations, against domestic and foreign audiences simultaneously. These programs were exposed, investigated, and officially terminated. But the institutional knowledge they represented, the understanding of how to shape information environments, how to manufacture credibility, how to discredit opponents, how to accelerate the adoption of preferred interpretations, that knowledge did not disappear. It lived in the minds of the people who had implemented these programs, and those people trained other people, and those people eventually moved into new institutional positions as the world changed around them. The second stage is the information revolution of the 1980s and 90s, the rise of 24-hour news cycles, the proliferation of cable television, and eventually the emergence of the internet created a new landscape in which narrative could spread with unprecedented speed. Voss argues that this was not simply a challenge for intelligence and power structures, it was an opportunity. A population receiving information in real time is also a population that can be shaped in real time. The tools that existed for managing information in the Cold War era were primitive compared to what became available as the media landscape fragmented and multiplied. The third stage, and this is where Voss's theory becomes genuinely difficult to assess, is the integration of advanced computational modelling into strategic planning, beginning in the 1990s and accelerating dramatically through the 2000s and beyond. Governments and major intelligence agencies began investing heavily in what are variously called predictive analytics, scenario simulation, and geopolitical forecasting. These systems use enormous amounts of data to model how populations, markets, and governments are likely to respond to various stimuli. They are, in principle, tools for understanding the future so that decisions can be made more wisely. But Voss is interested in a different question. If you can accurately model how a population will respond to an event before the event occurs, what does that mean for the relationship between the event and the response? He does not have a clean answer, but he has a hypothesis. Act 4. The network. One of the hardest things about understanding power in the modern world is that it does not look the way we were taught to expect it to look. We were taught to think of power in terms of individuals and institutions, presidents and generals and intelligence chiefs making decisions in rooms we're not allowed into, and power certainly still works that way, in part. But there is another kind of power that is harder to see precisely because it does not live in any single person or any single institution. It lives in relationships, in patterns of communication and coordination that span organizations and borders and decades. Voss begins mapping what he calls the coordination layer. It is not a secret cabal. He is careful about that. It is not a room full of hooded figures making decisions about the fate of the world. What he is describing is something more prosaic and in some ways more difficult to confront. A set of overlapping networks of individuals who share certain assumptions, certain loyalties, certain long-term objectives, and who have developed over decades the habit of informal coordination, of knowing what the other players in the network are likely to want, and adjusting their own actions accordingly, without explicit instruction or formal communication. These networks span government, finance, intelligence, and media. They are not monolithic. They contain factions and disagreements and competing interests, but they share a common core, a belief in the necessity of managing public perception as a tool of governance, and a level of sophistication in doing so that the general public does not fully appreciate. The evidence Voss compiles is largely circumstantial, the kind of evidence that is genuinely compelling if you accept the framework he is offering, and that looks like paranoia if you do not. He tracks the movement of personnel between government agencies, think tanks, major media organizations, and private consulting firms. He notices that certain individuals appear repeatedly at critical junctures, not in positions of formal authority, but in positions of informal influence. He maps the funding flows between intelligence-adjacent foundations and the media organizations they support. He traces the development of certain policy narratives across time, noting the moments when they appear to shift in coordinated ways that cannot easily be explained by the independent decisions of unconnected actors. None of this is proof of anything, strictly speaking. Voss knows that. He is not claiming proof. He is claiming pattern recognition, and the pattern he sees is of a system that has learned, over decades, to operate below the threshold of visible conspiracy. A system that does not need to manufacture events because it has learned something more efficient: how to be ready when events occur. He begins to think of this as the difference between the Northwoods model and what came after it. The Northwoods model was crude. It proposed to create events from scratch, to build false realities and populate them with fake casualties and manufactured outrage. The approach it points toward in Voss's reading of the historical evidence is far more elegant. Not the creation of events, but the preparation of responses, the development of ready-made narratives, pre-positioned interpretations, and coordinated messaging frameworks that can be activated within hours of a real event, shaping how that event is understood before the dust has even settled. In this model, you do not need to plan the earthquake. You only need to plan what you'll say about it when it happens. And if you plan well enough, if your preparation is thorough enough, your networks reliable enough, your messaging rapid and authoritative enough, then the distinction between a manufactured event and a natural one becomes, from the perspective of the public experiencing it, largely irrelevant. The effect is the same. The narrative forms, the interpretation crystallizes, the policy follows. What Voss finds most chilling about this formulation, what keeps him returning to it even when he is trying to approach his work with the detached neutrality of a good analyst, is how rational it all sounds from the inside. Imagine being one of the people who operates within this system. You're not, in your own understanding, a deceiver. You're a professional. You have spent years, perhaps decades, studying how populations respond to crises, how narratives form and spread, how misinformation emerges and takes hold in the absence of rapid, authoritative communication. You have seen what happens when a major event occurs and the information environment is chaotic and unmanaged, the conspiracy theories that flourish, the panic that spreads, the political instability that follows. You have concluded reasonably that someone has to manage the information environment, and that it is better for that someone to be responsible, trained, and operating within institutional frameworks than to leave the field to less scrupulous actors. From inside this understanding, what you are doing is not manipulation. It is crisis communication. It is responsible governance in an environment where the alternative, an unmanaged information space, produces demonstrably worse outcomes. You're not lying to people. You are selecting, from among the true and supportable interpretations of events, the ones that will produce the best outcomes. You're shaping emphasis, not fabricating content. You're managing the tempo of information release to prevent panic, not suppressing inconvenient facts. This is how the system justifies itself to itself, and the justification is not without merit. The alternative, a totally unmanaged information environment during major crises, is genuinely chaotic and genuinely dangerous. The question Voss cannot stop asking is, who decides what the best outcomes are? Who decides which true and supportable interpretations get amplified and which get suppressed? Who decides when the management of emphasis crosses the line into the management of reality? And who watches the watchers? Who ensures that the people making these decisions are doing so in the public interest, rather than in the interest of the institutions and networks that grant them their power? These questions do not have clean answers. They may not have answers at all in any final sense. But the fact that they do not have answers does not make them less important. It makes them more important. The absence of accountability for the exercise of this kind of power is not a feature of a well-functioning system. It is a flaw, a fundamental flaw that the system has learned to obscure by wrapping itself in the language of responsibility and expertise and the management of complexity. Act 5. The mechanism. To understand how this might work in practice, Voss develops what he calls the feedback loop model. It is not a radical idea exactly. Versions of it have appeared in the academic literature on media and politics for decades. But Voss is interested in a specific and more disturbing version of it. The basic loop works like this. An event occurs. It can be genuinely unpredictable. A natural disaster, a terrorist attack, an economic crisis, a political assassination. The event is real. No one manufactured it. But the moment it occurs, it enters a system that has been waiting for it. Pre-prepared narratives are activated. Key interpretations are circulated rapidly through networks of trusted voices. Journalists, think tank analysts, government officials, academic experts who deliver consistent messages with apparent authority and independence. Alternative interpretations are quickly characterized as dangerous, irresponsible, or conspiratorial. Public reaction forms around the dominant narrative. Polling captures the shift in public opinion. Policy decisions that had been contemplated in advance are now implemented with democratic legitimacy, because the public, shaped by the narrative, supports them. And the long-term structural consequences of those decisions, the redistribution of power, the expansion of certain institutions, the contraction of others, the realignment of alliances, reshape the geopolitical landscape in ways that benefit certain interests over others. The loop closes and begins again. What makes Voss's version of this model distinctive is his insistence that the loop is not passive. It is not simply that powerful interests benefit from how events are interpreted. That much is obvious, and has been obvious for a very long time. Voss is arguing something more specific, that the loop is monitored and adjusted in real time by actors who have both the capability and the motivation to do so. That the narrative environment following major events is not an emergent property of many independent actors responding to the same information, but a managed environment in which certain outcomes are deliberately cultivated and others are deliberately suppressed. The evidence he cites for this is largely documentary. Leaked emails, declassified planning documents, the accounts of journalists and intelligence officers who have described, in various contexts and with various degrees of specificity, the existence of coordinated narrative management operations. He's careful not to overstate the evidence. He acknowledges the gaps. He acknowledges that much of what he's describing is inference from incomplete data. But he also points to something that is difficult to explain away: the speed, the coordination, the consistency. In the modern information environment, major events are followed almost immediately by a remarkably coherent narrative response. Within hours, sometimes less, the major contours of how an event will be understood are already in place across dozens of major media organizations, in the statements of government officials, in the analysis of recognized experts. This coherence might be explained as simply the product of a shared professional culture. Journalists and analysts trained in the same traditions, drawing on the same sources, reaching similar conclusions independently. Voss does not dismiss this explanation, but he argues that it is insufficient, that the degree of coherence and the speed with which it appears requires something more than shared professional norms. It requires infrastructure, preparation, and coordination. He begins looking for that infrastructure. What he finds is not a smoking gun. It is something more like a series of architectural features, the shape of a building's foundation, visible if you know what you're looking for, but invisible if you are simply moving through the space without asking questions. He finds policy planning documents that describe, in general terms, the importance of rapid narrative framing in crisis situations. He finds organisational structures within government agencies and their private sector partners that appear to be designed specifically for the rapid production and distribution of interpretive frameworks. He finds funding flows that connect intelligence-adjacent organisations to media institutions in ways that are not publicly disclosed. He finds evidence of training programmes, some of them described in partially declassified documents, that prepare certain kinds of professionals to play specific roles in information environments during crises. None of it is the Northwoods memo. None of it says, explicitly, we are planning to shape how you understand the world. But taken together, it builds a picture, and the picture looks like a system. Act 6. The simulation layer. This is where the story takes a turn that even Voss in his most careful moments acknowledges is speculative. This is where the documented history and the provable patterns give way to something that lives at the edge of what can be verified, not in the realm of fantasy, but in the realm of plausible extrapolation from known capabilities. It begins with a question about the modelling systems. The existence of sophisticated geopolitical modelling and scenario simulation within governments and intelligence agencies is not a secret. It is openly discussed in academic literature, in public policy documents, and in the memoirs of former intelligence officials. These systems use vast quantities of data, economic indicators, social media activity, historical patterns of political behaviour, demographic information, communication network analyses, to build models of how populations and governments are likely to respond to various scenarios. They are officially tools for understanding risk and preparing policy responses. They help governments anticipate crises, plan for contingencies, and make more informed decisions in uncertain environments. This is all entirely reasonable and, in principle, entirely beneficial. The ability to anticipate how a crisis might unfold and to prepare responses in advance seems obviously valuable. No serious person argues that governments should not try to think ahead. But Voss asks a different question. If these systems are sufficiently accurate, if they can genuinely predict with meaningful probability how a population will respond to a given event, then they represent something that has never existed before in the history of governance: the ability to know the outcome of a social process before the process begins. And that capability, in the hands of actors who are also capable of shaping information environments, creates a possibility that Voss finds deeply disturbing. He calls it the pre-response concept. The pre-response concept works like this. Before a significant event occurs, or in the immediate aftermath, before public interpretation is solidified, actors with access to sophisticated modelling systems already know, with high confidence, how the public will respond to the dominant narrative if it is presented in a certain way. They know which framings will generate support, which will generate opposition, which will be absorbed without significant resistance. They know the approximate trajectory of public opinion under various narrative conditions. And because they know these things, they can make decisions about narrative management not on the basis of guesswork or intuition, but on the basis of predictive modelling. In other words, the response is prepared before the event is fully processed. The narrative is selected not after the facts are in, but before, on the basis of what the modelling suggests will be most effective in achieving the desired policy outcome. The facts are then fitted to the narrative rather than the narrative to the facts. If this sounds familiar, it is because it rhymes with the central insight of Operation Northwoods, which was, at its core, a proposal to design the narrative before the event, and then create the event to fit the narrative. What Voss is describing is more sophisticated, more deniable and more powerful, not the creation of false events, but the pre-selection of interpretive frameworks that will shape how real events are understood. You do not need to manufacture the crisis if you already know how to manage the perception of the crisis before it arrives. He spends months trying to find evidence of this, not just the existence of the modelling systems, which is documented, but evidence of their use in the specific way he is describing. He finds fragments, partial accounts, documents that gesture toward capabilities without describing their application, references in planning literature to concepts like narrative pre-positioning and pre-crisis messaging frameworks that suggest a level of advanced preparation more thoroughgoing than anything that has been publicly acknowledged. He cannot prove it, but he cannot disprove it either, and the more he looks at the behaviour of information environments in the aftermath of major events, the more convinced he becomes that what he is seeing is not improvisation. It is execution. Act 7. The Modern Northwoods. Voss eventually names the system he believes he has identified. He calls it the Northwoods Protocol. It is not an official designation. It is not the name of any real program, any classified document, any organisational structure he has found evidence of. It is a conceptual label, his way of drawing a line between the crude physical false flag proposals of 1962 and the sophisticated informational global system he believes has evolved from the same underlying principle. The name is deliberately chosen to honour the connection while acknowledging the transformation. The original Northwoods was about physical events, bombings, sinkings, staged attacks. The protocol, as Voss conceives it, has left the physical realm almost entirely behind. It operates in the domain of information, of interpretation, of the space between an event and its meaning. The core principle of the protocol, as Voss articulates it, can be stated simply: in the modern world, the most important thing about an event is not what happened, but what people believe happened. And the most powerful actors in any geopolitical system are not necessarily those who control the most territory or the most weapons, but those who control the process by which events are interpreted and meanings are assigned. This is not a particularly radical claim in isolation. Media theorists and political scientists have been making variations of it for decades. The idea that narrative shapes reality, that the stories we tell about events matter more than the events themselves, is a staple of modern social science. What Voss is adding is a specific and more disturbing layer: the claim that this understanding has been operationalized, turned into institutional practice, equipped with technological tools, staffed by professionals, funded with serious resources, and deployed systematically in the service of specific power interests. He is not describing a world in which narrative matters. He is describing a world in which narrative is managed, and managed deliberately, and managed well. The objective of the protocol, as Voss understands it, is not destabilization. It is not chaos. The people he believes are operating within this system are not anarchists or nihilists. They are, in their own understanding, responsible actors, maintaining a kind of geopolitical homeostasis, preventing the kinds of rapid destabilization that could lead to genuinely catastrophic outcomes. The protocol, from this perspective, is a tool of management, of controlled direction, a way of keeping the enormous, complex, volatile system of global politics moving within acceptable parameters. From inside the system, it probably looks like wisdom, like responsibility, like the exercise of hard-earned institutional knowledge in service of stability and order. From outside the system, from the perspective of the populations being managed, it looks like something else entirely. It looks like the world making decisions about itself without asking you. A-Seat 8. The Final Discovery. The document arrives in pieces. That is the first thing Voss notices. Not a complete document, but fragments, sections that appear in different archives, attached to different files, stamped with different classification dates, as if the whole had been deliberately scattered to prevent any single person from reading it in full. He spends nearly 8 months reassembling it. When he does, it is not what he expected. It is not dramatic. It is not a smoking gun. It reads like every other planning document he has spent his career studying, careful, bureaucratic, deliberately opaque. But the language in it stops him, not because it is alarming in an obvious way, but because it is recognizable, because the phrases it uses, managed escalation, narrative synchronization, multi-domain response shaping, are the phrases of a system that has been thinking about these problems for a long time and has developed a technical vocabulary for discussing them. The document does not mention Operation Northwoods, it does not mention false flags, or manufactured events, or staged crises. It speaks entirely in the language of response management, of information environment optimization, of coordinated strategic communication. But the logic underneath the language is the same logic, the same understanding that narrative is the primary terrain of modern power, the same recognition that the most important decisions are made not in the moment of crisis but in the preparation for it, the same assumption that populations can and should be managed, not through deception, precisely, but through careful control of the interpretive frameworks available to them. Voss sits with the document for a long time. He is a careful analyst. He does not want to overclaim. He knows the difference between suggestive and conclusive. He knows that a document that uses certain language does not prove that the activities the language describes are actually occurring, or that they are occurring in the specific ways he suspects. He knows that pattern recognition, however compelling, is not the same as evidence. But he also knows what he knows. He knows what 15 years of studying the history of intelligence operations has taught him about the gap between what institutions say they do and what they actually do. He knows what the Church Committee found when it finally looked seriously at what American intelligence agencies had been doing in the decades before the hearings. He knows that the things that eventually get confirmed, the things that eventually surface in declassified documents, in whistleblower accounts, in investigative reporting, are almost invariably less shocking than the reality they represent, because by the time they are confirmed, the most sensitive elements have already been destroyed, reclassified, or sanitized. He knows that the history of intelligence operations is a history of revealed capability exceeding anticipated capability. Every time the veil is pulled back, what is revealed is more sophisticated, more pervasive, more institutionalized than anyone expected. And so, he sits with the document and asks the only question that matters. If this is the version of these capabilities that has been poorly enough concealed to leave traces in a public archive, what does the well-concealed version look like? He does not have an answer. But the question keeps him awake for a very long time. And in those sleepless hours, lying in his apartment in DC while the city hums its 24-hour frequency outside his window, he keeps returning to a single passage he once read in a memoir by a former senior intelligence officer. The memoir was largely forgettable, the kind of carefully managed self-portrait that retiring officials tend to produce, revelatory enough to seem honest, sanitized enough to remain safe. But there was one passage that had stayed with him for years, lodged in his memory like a splinter that refused to be ignored. The officer was describing the feeling of reading classified assessments of public opinion during a major international crisis, and he wrote, with what seemed like genuine satisfaction, "We already knew before the press conference, before the speech, before the first headline, how this would land. We had the model, we knew the outcome. The only variable was execution." At the time, Voss had read this as a small boast, an old man's nostalgia for the feeling of being at the centre of things, of having access to information that the rest of the world lacked. The kind of casual superiority that institutional power produces in the people it grants access to. He had filed it away and moved on. Now, sitting with the fragments of the document, he reads it differently. Now it sounds less like a boast and more like a description of a capability that was not exceptional, not remarkable, not reserved for moments of unusual crisis, but routine, standard, built into the operating procedure, the ability to know, before the public knew, how the public would react, and to make decisions on the basis of that knowledge, quietly, efficiently, without asking anyone's permission. "We already knew," the officer had written. "The only variable was execution." Voss puts the fragment down, pours himself a glass of water, stands at his window for a long time, watching the lights of the city below him, thinking about all the millions of people behind those lights who are making their way through a world they believe they understand, who are reading the news and drawing their conclusions and forming their opinions and casting their votes, and feeling, in some fundamental way, that the reality they are living in is the reality that is actually there. Not a curated version of it, not a managed approximation, but the thing itself. He does not know if they are right. He has spent 15 years trying to find out, and he is still not sure. That uncertainty is, in some ways, the most honest conclusion he can reach. The world is genuinely complex. Power is genuinely distributed across many actors with many agendas. The appearance of coordination can be produced by shared interests without any explicit coordination. The narrative coherence that follows major events might be, in part, a genuine emergent property of a shared information environment rather than a managed outcome. He cannot rule this out. He has to acknowledge the possibility, even as the pattern he has mapped suggests otherwise. But here is what he cannot unknow. The capability exists. The institutional knowledge exists. The technological tools exist. The financial resources and the organizational infrastructure and the professional training required to operationalize what he is describing, all of it exists. It is not theoretical. It is documented. And if it exists, and if the historical record of intelligence operations is any guide at all to how institutions behave when they believe they have good reasons and are not being watched, then the question is not whether it is being used, but how and to what end, and who is deciding. Those are questions he does not know how to answer, but the question keeps him awake for a very long time. Epilogue. The system that doesn't need to hide. Here is what Voss eventually concludes, and what makes his conclusion different from the conclusions of most conspiracy theorists. The system he's describing does not need secrecy in the traditional sense. It does not require a vault full of sensitive documents and a team of men in dark suits making sure no one gets near them. It does not require the kind of active concealment that, when it fails, produces the spectacular revelations of a Watergate or a church committee. It is something more durable and more difficult to expose precisely because it does not depend on secrecy for its protection. It depends on complexity. The system is visible. The pieces of it are visible. The policy planning documents are public. The funding flows, while sometimes obscure, are traceable. The organizational structures exist in org charts. The individuals who move between government and intelligence and media and finance have public careers and public biographies. The research on predictive modelling and scenario simulation is published in journals and discussed at conferences. None of it is hidden exactly. It is simply distributed across so many institutions, so many documents, so many individual careers and decisions and relationships, that perceiving it as a system, as a coherent, functioning, intentional whole, requires exactly the kind of sustained, cross-disciplinary, pattern-oriented analysis that almost no one has the time or the resources or the institutional support to conduct. The system's protection is its complexity. Its invisibility is an emergent property of its scale. And that, Voss concludes, is the most disturbing thing about it. Not that it exists, but that it has found a form of existence that is essentially immune to the kinds of exposure that have historically constrained institutional power. You cannot leak a document that reveals the whole system because the whole system is not in any document. You cannot expose a conspiracy that is not, in any strict sense, a conspiracy, that consists not of explicit coordination, but of shared assumptions and institutional habits and the accumulated expertise of people who have been thinking about these problems for their entire professional lives. You can see the parts, you can name the parts, you can document the parts, but the whole remains just beyond the edge of what can be proven, present everywhere, provable nowhere, and perhaps that is the final evolution of the idea that was first articulated, clumsily, explicitly, in the language of staged bombings and fake funerals, in a classified memorandum in 1962. The original plan was to create events that would shape how people thought and what they believed. The modern system has learned something more elegant, more durable, and infinitely harder to refuse. It does not create events. It shapes the world in which events are interpreted. It builds the frameworks through which reality is processed. It prepares the categories through which experience is sorted and meaning is assigned. And if you control the categories, if you control the framework, then you do not need to control anything else, because everything that happens will be understood through the lens you have provided. That lens is invisible because it is everywhere. It is inescapable because it is the medium through which reality itself is transmitted. And it has been carefully, patiently, brilliantly built by people who understood, long before the rest of us, that the world is not won in battles or elections or board meetings. It is won in the quiet, invisible process of teaching people how to see. The original plan was to create events. The modern system only needs to shape how the world responds to them. Reflection. There is a question worth sitting with as you drift towards sleep tonight. Not whether the specific theory Daniel Voss developed is correct. That is a question for researchers and investigators and historians, and it may not have a clean answer for a very long time, if ever. The question worth sitting with is simpler, and in some ways more personal. It is this: how do you know what you believe, and why do you believe it? Not about politics, not about any specific event or crisis or controversy, but about the world in general. The stories you hold about how the world works, who holds power and how they use it, what is happening and why. Where did those stories come from? Who told them to you? What were the conditions under which you received them? And is it possible that some of the certainties you carry are not things you arrived at through your own investigation, but things you absorbed from an environment that was, deliberately or not, shaped to make them feel obvious? This is not a nihilistic question. It is not a question that leads nowhere. It is the beginning of the only kind of thinking that has ever produced genuine understanding. Slow, careful, skeptical, humble attention to the space between what is claimed and what is demonstrated. The willingness to notice the pattern without overclaiming the pattern. The capacity to hold uncertainty without collapsing into either comfortable belief or convenient cynicism. Operation Northwoods was a real document. Its proposals were real. The men who drafted it were real, and the institution that produced them was real, and the principle they were drawing on, that controlling narrative is more powerful than controlling territory, was real then and is real now. What has happened to that principle in the 60-plus years since that document was locked away is a question that does not have a settled answer. It may never have a fully settled answer, but it is a question that deserves to be asked, carefully and persistently, by anyone who cares about the relationship between power and truth, and the stubborn human insistence on knowing what is real. Hey, before we get into tonight's story, a quick but genuine thank you to the comment that suggested this one. You know who you are. If you've been listening on Spotify and you haven't left a review yet, it genuinely takes about 10 seconds and it means more to this channel than you probably realise. Okay, now let's go somewhere ancient. There is a story so old that most people assume it cannot possibly be true. It comes from a time before the Roman Empire, before the birth of Christ, before most of the civilizations we consider ancient had even fully formed. It is a story that the Greeks told each other for centuries, passed down through oral tradition, and eventually committed to writing by a poet named Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century before the Common Era. And at its centre stands a figure unlike anything else in the ancient mythological record. Not a god, not a hero, not a monster in the conventional sense. A machine, a bronze giant, massive, hollow, animated by something flowing through a single sealed vein in his body. He circled the island of Crete 3 times every day, hurling boulders at ships that came too close, heating his metal body until it glowed, and then embracing those who dared to land. He was called Talos, and for thousands of years scholars have filed him neatly under the category of mythology and moved on. But what if that was the wrong category? What if Talos was not a story invented to explain something unknown, but a story preserved to remember something real? Tonight, we follow that question into territory that sits at the strange border between ancient history and modern engineering. We examine what the myths actually say, what the archaeology of Crete actually suggests, and what one modern line of thinking proposes, that the ancient world may have contained machines that we have completely written out of our understanding of history, not because the evidence was never there, but because we were never looking for it. This is Talos, the machine of the gods. Act 1. The myth that refused to stay myth. To understand why Talos is unusual, you need to understand what most ancient myths actually look like. The Greek mythological tradition is extraordinarily rich. It includes gods who transform into animals to pursue lovers, heroes who descend into the underworld and return, monsters born from the union of divine beings and mortals, sea creatures that swallow ships whole, and creatures of every imaginable variety. The Greeks did not lack imagination. Their mythology is vast, internally inconsistent in places, and wonderfully human in its concerns. Love, jealousy, power, pride, fate. Most of these myths operate according to a certain kind of logic. The creatures in them are either divinely powerful or monstrous by nature. The gods interfere in human affairs because they are emotional beings who take sides. Heroes succeed or fail based on their virtue, their lineage, or the favour of Olympus. This is the internal grammar of Greek mythology, and when you read enough of it, you begin to recognise its patterns. Talos does not quite fit the pattern. He appears most completely in the Argonautica, the epic poem written by Apollonius of Rhodes, which tells the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and their quest for the Golden Fleece. The Argonauts, returning from their voyage, attempt to make landfall on the island of Crete. And they are stopped, not by a god, not by a sea monster, not by a curse, but by a figure described in remarkably concrete, almost mechanical terms. Apollonius describes Talos as a man of bronze. He is said to have been the last of the race of bronze men, the men of the Age of Bronze that preceded the Age of Heroes in Greek mythological chronology. The god Hephaestus, divine smith and craftsman of Olympus, is credited with his creation. He was given as a gift to the mythological king Minos, ruler of Crete, to protect the island from invaders. His method of patrol is described precisely. He circles the island 3 times daily, walking its perimeter, watching the sea. When the Argonauts approach, Talos hurls fragments of rock at their ship from the shoreline, enormous pieces broken from the cliffs, thrown with a force that no living creature should have been able to generate. The Argonauts cannot land. They are outmatched by a guardian they do not understand. It is the sorceress Medea who ultimately defeats him, not through force, but through a kind of surgical precision. She uses her magic in the text described as the power of the evil eye or a direct psychic assault to cause Talos to stumble against the rocks of the shore. And here is the detail that has haunted scholars for centuries. In stumbling, Talos scrapes the ankle of his bronze body against the rock, and from that scrape, from a place described in the text as a membrane or a plug covering a vein at his ankle, there flows not blood, not ichor in the divine sense, but a dark fluid, and Talos dies, not falls, dies, as if something essential, something internal, has been lost. The text is unambiguous on one point. There is a single vein running through the body of Talos from his neck to his ankle, sealed at the bottom with a bronze nail or a plug of membrane. Through this vein flows ichor, described elsewhere in Greek mythology as the blood of the gods, the fluid that animates divine beings. Remove the seal, and the fluid drains out, and when the fluid drains, Talos stops. Now, hold that image in your mind for a moment. A hollow bronze figure, a single sealed channel running through its interior, a fluid flowing through that channel that provides animation and function, a mechanical terminus, a plug, that when removed causes the entire system to fail. This is not the description of a monster in any conventional mythological sense. This is the description of a system, a closed system with a single point of failure, a pressurized interior with a release valve at the lowest point of the structure, the ankle, exactly where gravity would cause any internal fluid to accumulate if the system were compromised. The question that a modern engineer might ask, looking at this description, is not whether it sounds mythological. It sounds perfectly mechanical. The question is, where did this description come from? Ancient myths rarely emerge from nowhere. They have sources. Those sources are usually either natural phenomena that needed explaining, historical events distorted over time, or cultural anxieties given symbolic form. A sun god riding a chariot explains the movement of the sun. A flood myth remembers a real catastrophic flood. A hero who slays a monster might remember a real warrior who killed a real dangerous animal or human enemy. So where does Talos come from? The straightforward scholarly answer is that he represents a mythologized version of the concept of bronze technology, a metaphor for the Age of Bronze, the era of metal tools and weapons that preceded the Iron Age in Greek historical memory. The men of bronze in Greek myth were a race of hard, warlike beings, and Talos as the last of them makes thematic sense as a symbol of that era's end. That interpretation is reasonable, it is tidy, and it may be partially correct. But it does not explain the vein. Mythological creatures do not typically come with hydraulic specifications. Dragons breathe fire, but no ancient text explains the internal anatomy of a dragon's fire-breathing apparatus with the precision of an engineering document. Cyclopes are large and one-eyed, but no myth describes the optical nerve arrangement that produces monocular vision. The gods bleed ichor, but no text diagrams their circulatory system with anything approaching the specificity of the Talos description. The vein, the plug, the single point of failure, the drainage of the animating fluid. These details are precise in a way that purely symbolic storytelling rarely is, and that precision is what has kept Talos alive in a certain kind of imagination. The imagination that asks, what if the Greeks were not inventing this? What if they were remembering it? Asked 2. The world that Talos came from. To ask whether Talos could have been real, you first have to understand the civilization that the myth places him in. Because Talos is not simply a Greek story, he is specifically a Cretan story. He belongs to Crete. He is guarding Crete. He was given to the king of Crete. And this geographic specificity matters enormously, because Crete was not just any ancient island. Crete was the heart of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans are one of the most extraordinary and least understood civilizations in the ancient world. They flourished on the island of Crete and across the Aegean from roughly 3000 BCE to approximately 1400 BCE, a span of roughly 1600 years, longer than the entire history of the Roman Empire. At their height, they were the dominant maritime power of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their trading networks extended to Egypt, to the Levant, to mainland Greece, to Anatolia. Their influence shaped the cultures around them in ways that are still being mapped by archaeologists. What makes the Minoans remarkable, and what makes them relevant to the question of Talos, is not just their power, it is the sophistication of their material culture, and the fact that much of it remains unexplained. The palace complex at Knossos, excavated beginning in the early 20th century by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans, contains features that continue to surprise researchers. There are drainage systems of remarkable complexity, multiple interlocking terracotta channels that appear to have been designed with an understanding of fluid dynamics and pressure management. There are light wells engineered to channel natural light deep into the interior of multi-story structures. There are storage systems designed for the controlled preservation of large quantities of goods across multiple seasons. The Minoans also appear to have had a highly organised administrative apparatus, evidenced by the presence of the Linear A script, a writing system that has never been fully deciphered, and later Linear B, which was deciphered in the 1950s and confirmed to be an early form of Greek used for administrative record keeping. The sheer volume of administrative tablets found at Minoan and later Mycenaean sites suggests a civilization running complex bureaucratic operations, tracking resources, coordinating labour, managing trade across vast distances. And the Minoans were bronze workers, advanced ones. Bronze artefacts from Minoan Crete include tools, weapons, vessels, and decorative objects of considerable technical sophistication. The island was not rich in copper or tin itself, the two metals that combine to form bronze, which means the Minoans were importing raw materials from considerable distances and processing them with enough skill to produce goods that were in demand across the region. This is the civilization that the Talos myth is connected to, not a primitive island culture, a sophisticated, maritime, technologically capable civilization that was building complex drainage systems, managing fluid pressure in stone channels, working metal with precision, and running an administrative state complex enough to require its own writing system. And then, around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the Minoan civilization collapsed. The causes are debated. The eruption of the Thera volcano, modern Santorini, roughly 100 kilometres north of Crete, around 1600 BCE, is frequently cited as a contributing factor. The eruption was among the most powerful in recorded geological history. It would have generated enormous tsunamis, blanketed the surrounding region in ash, disrupted agricultural cycles for years, and likely devastated Minoan maritime infrastructure along Crete's northern coast. Subsequent earthquakes may have finished what the eruption began. But the collapse was not instantaneous. It played out over generations, and with it went something that we may not have fully accounted for: the accumulated technical knowledge of 1600 years of advanced civilization. Knowledge about engineering, about metallurgy, about fluid systems, about building large complex structures. Knowledge that was not necessarily written down, or if it was written in a script that we still cannot read. When the Minoans faded, so did their knowledge, and the Greeks who came after them, who absorbed fragments of Minoan culture and mythology, preserved what they could understand, and transformed what they could not. A machine becomes a giant. A hydraulic system becomes a divine vein. A bronze automaton becomes the last of the bronze race. A technical achievement becomes a myth. This is not a new idea. The transformation of real things into mythology through the process of transmission across generations is something that historians of religion and mythology have documented extensively. The gods of ancient Mesopotamia may contain traces of real historical rulers. The flood myths found across dozens of unconnected cultures may all trace back to real catastrophic flooding events in the post-glacial period. The Trojan War, once considered pure myth, turned out to have a real historical basis when the site of Troy was excavated in the 19th century. History has a habit of hiding in stories, and sometimes the stories preserve details so specific, so technically precise, that the hiding becomes visible if you know where to look. Act 3. The investigator and the pattern. Let us follow the thread now into the present. Not because there is a definitive answer waiting at the end. There isn't, not yet. But because the questions themselves reveal something important about what we think we know. Imagine a researcher, a historian, not a fantasist, someone trained in the archaeology and material culture of the ancient Aegean, who has spent years in the conventional academic world examining real artifacts, real sites, real texts. Someone who knows the difference between mythology and history, who understands the scholarly frameworks, who respects the evidence, and who, for that very reason, is troubled by something that the conventional frameworks don't quite explain. The trouble begins not with Talos specifically, but with a pattern, because Talos is not alone. Across ancient cultures that had no direct contact with each other, that developed independently, that spoke different languages and worshipped different gods, there appears a recurring figure, an animated being made of metal or stone, a construct, not a creature, a made thing, not a born thing. In ancient Mesopotamia, specifically in texts from the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions, there are references to statues that move, that speak, that perform functions within temple complexes. The construction of these statues is described in terms that blur the line between craft and animation. The god who inhabits the statue is described in ways that sometimes suggest not divine presence but mechanical operation. In ancient Egypt, the temple complexes at Karnak and elsewhere contain mechanisms, counterweights, hydraulic systems, hidden chambers, that allowed priests to create effects that would have appeared miraculous to worshippers. Doors that opened as if by divine command, statues that seemed to move, voices that emerged from apparently solid stone. We have explanations for these. They were theatrical devices, clever engineering in service of religious spectacle, but they confirm that the ancient world was capable of creating animated effects using engineered systems. In ancient India, the Mahabharata and other Sanskrit texts contain references to mechanical beings called yantras, automated constructs, some of them described as guards or servants, built by divine craftsmen. The level of specificity in some of these descriptions is striking. They are not simply enchanted statues. They are described as having internal mechanisms, as requiring maintenance, as being capable of malfunction. In ancient China, historical texts from the Zhou dynasty period describe mechanical automata, artificial people and animals built by craftsmen of legendary skill. The descriptions include references to internal organs, to systems of pipes and channels, to materials both organic and metallic. One famous account describes a life-sized figure built by a craftsman named Yan Shi that could walk, sing and move its eyes, and that when dissected by the king revealed an interior of leather, wood, lacquer and various coloured materials, arranged in a way that mimicked the structure of a living body. These accounts span cultures, continents, millennia, and they share, beneath their surface differences, a common underlying concept, that it is possible to build something that moves, something that functions, something that performs the actions of a living being, using materials and methods that are fundamentally mechanical rather than biological. The question is not whether the ancients imagined automata. They clearly did. The question is whether imagination was all that was happening. The Antikythera mechanism was discovered in 1900 CE, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera. For decades after its discovery, its nature was not understood. It was a lump of corroded bronze, broken into fragments, clearly ancient, clearly complex, but seemingly impossible. When it was eventually analysed using X-ray and later computer tomography, what emerged was extraordinary. The Antikythera mechanism is a mechanical computer, a gear-driven device of extraordinary precision, containing at minimum 30 separate interlocking bronze gears designed to calculate and display astronomical cycles, the positions of the sun and moon, the timing of eclipses, the scheduling of the ancient Olympic and other Panhellenic games. It is calibrated with an accuracy that would not be achieved again in the Western world for more than 1,000 years. It was built approximately 2,100 years ago. Before the Antikythera mechanism was understood, no one would have believed it possible. The conventional understanding of ancient technology would have placed such a device firmly in the category of impossible. And yet there it was, real, functional, precisely engineered, recovered from the sea. the Antikythera mechanism did not require us to rewrite everything we know about the ancient world, but it required us to expand what we thought possible. It demonstrated that the ancient Greeks, or someone in the ancient Mediterranean, possessed mechanical engineering knowledge that was substantially more advanced than the scholarly consensus had assumed. If the Antikythera mechanism is real, what else might be real that we have not yet found? Ast 4. What the vein might mean. Return now to the technical description of Talos, the single vein, the plug at the ankle, the fluid called ichor. Modern engineers looking at this description have proposed several frameworks for understanding it, not as metaphor but as potential mechanical reality. The first possibility is hydraulic, a large hollow bronze structure with an internal channel through which a pressurized fluid flows would have several interesting properties. The pressure of the fluid could provide structural rigidity, functioning somewhat like the way that hydraulic pressure maintains the shape and structural integrity of certain modern, inflatable and fluid-filled structures. The circulation of the fluid could also provide a method for distributing something, heat perhaps, or a chemical reaction, throughout the interior of the structure. The single sealed point at the ankle, the lowest physical point on an upright structure, is precisely where you would place a drainage valve in any hydraulic system, because gravity would ensure that when the seal was broken, the fluid would drain completely and rapidly. The second possibility is thermal. The myth specifically describes Talos as being capable of heating his bronze body to an extreme temperature and using that heat as a weapon, embracing enemies until they were burned or killed. A hollow bronze structure with an internal channel through which a heated fluid was circulated could achieve this effect. Bronze is an excellent conductor of heat. A circulating thermal fluid in the interior would rapidly heat the exterior surface. The ancient world had access to heated fluids, steam, heated water, heated oils, and had demonstrated in other contexts the capacity to engineer fluid circulation systems. The third possibility, the most speculative but also the most intriguing, involves electrochemistry. A principle similar to the voltaic cell was demonstrated in the 20th century to have been potentially known in antiquity. The Baghdad battery, a series of ceramic jars found in Iraq and dating to roughly the Parthian period around 200 BCE, contains a configuration of copper cylinders, iron rods, and acidic electrolyte that, when assembled, generates a measurable electrical current. Whether the Baghdad battery was actually used for this purpose remains debated. It may have been a storage vessel for scrolls or other materials, but the fact that the configuration exists in a demonstrably ancient context suggests that electrochemical principles may have been encountered, if not fully understood, in antiquity. An internal conducting fluid, ichor, the blood of the gods, a fluid that carries divine life, flowing through a bronze body might be, in this framework, a description of an electrical circuit. The single vein, a conducting channel. The seal at the ankle, a ground point. The animation of Talos not mystical but electromechanical. This is speculation. It is important to say that clearly. There is no direct archaeological evidence for an ancient electrical or hydraulic automaton of the scale described in the Talos myth. But the point of the speculation is not to prove that Talos existed. The point is to demonstrate that the description of Talos, when examined with engineering rather than literary eyes, is not absurd. It is coherent. It describes a system that is mechanically plausible, not using principles that the ancient world would have needed to invent from scratch, but using principles that were adjacent to things the ancient world already demonstrably understood. The Minoans built hydraulic drainage systems. The ancient Greeks built astronomical computers. The ancient Egyptians moved massive stone blocks using fluid-lubricated ramps and leverage systems of considerable engineering sophistication. The ancient Chinese described internal mechanisms in their automata accounts, with a level of specificity that suggests either very detailed imagination or something closer to technical knowledge. At what point does the accumulation of adjacent evidence become worth taking seriously? Act 5. The Hephaestus problem. There is another element of the Talos myth that deserves attention. and it is the element that most clearly ties Talos to a broader pattern in Greek mythology. Hephaestus, the god who created Talos according to the ancient sources, is not a typical Olympian god. He is the divine craftsman, the smith of the gods, the maker of impossible things. His workshop, variously located by different ancient sources at volcanic sites, beneath Etna in the Aegean Islands, produces objects of extraordinary technical sophistication. He makes the armour of Achilles, so detailed and elaborate that Homer's description of it in the Iliad has been called one of the finest pieces of artistic description in ancient literature. He makes the palace of the gods on Olympus. He makes mechanical servants, golden women who assist him in his forge, described as possessing intelligence and speech, and the ability to work independently. He makes Talos, and he makes one other thing that is relevant here: the golden and silver dogs of Alcinous, described in Homer's Odyssey as guardians of the palace of the Phaeacian king, immortal and ageless, the work of Hephaestus. These dogs do not require food or aging. They are made, not born. They guard automatically without instruction. The pattern in the Hephaestus mythology is remarkably consistent. He creates things that function autonomously, that perform tasks without ongoing human direction, that possess some quality of animation without being alive in the biological sense. And crucially, he is associated with fire and with volcanic sites, with the intense heat required for metalworking. Hephaestus is not described the way other gods are described. He is lame, injured, limited, working rather than ruling. He is the only Olympian with a clear profession, a specialized function. He is, in a sense, the least divine of the gods, the one who makes things rather than simply commanding them to exist, and the things he makes are mechanical in a way that the creations of other gods are not. Some historians of religion have proposed that Hephaestus represents a mythologized memory of a real class of craftsmen, metalworkers, engineers, smiths, whose skills were so far beyond the ordinary that they seemed divine to those who witnessed their work. The fire, the forge, the impossible creations, all of these translate naturally into divine myth, if the underlying reality is simply extraordinarily advanced craftsmanship that is no longer understood. If Hephaestus represents advanced engineering, then his creations, including Talos, represent advanced engineering artifacts, and the specific detail of the Cretan location, the specific detail of the Minoan king Minos as the recipient, the specific detail of a bronze guardian with an internal hydraulic system. All of these begin to look less like mythology and more like a technical document written in the only language available to people who could see something but could not fully explain it. Ast 6. What the Earth might remember. There is a detail in the modern investigation of Crete that is difficult to discuss without either overstating or understating its significance. Beginning in the late 20th century and continuing through the early decades of the 21st, remote sensing technologies, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, LiDAR aerial scanning, and various forms of subsurface electromagnetic survey have been applied to sites across the ancient Mediterranean, including sites on and around Crete. These technologies have revealed remarkable things: buried structures, hidden chambers, subterranean complexes that no surface survey would have detected. The archaeological landscape of the ancient world, it turns out, is vastly more complex than what is visible above ground. The Minoan palace at Knossos, for all that has been excavated, sits above a substrate that has been only partially explored. The surrounding region contains anomalies that have not been fully investigated. Storage areas, drainage systems, possible subterranean spaces. The map of what is there is still being drawn. None of this proves that a large metallic structure lies beneath the soil of Crete. To claim otherwise would be irresponsible. But it does establish something important. We do not know everything that is there. The ancient Minoans built extensively, including below ground. Their drainage and fluid management systems extended into the earth in ways that surface archaeology cannot fully capture. What lies beneath the rubble of a civilization that collapsed 3,500 years ago is, quite literally, unknown. And in that unknown there is a question that responsible inquiry should not simply dismiss. What were the Minoans capable of that we have not yet found evidence of? The history of archaeology is, in a meaningful sense, the history of things that everyone was sure didn't exist until they were found. Troy was myth until it wasn't. The Minoan civilization itself was essentially mythological, known only from Greek legends about the labyrinth and the Minotaur, until Arthur Evans excavated Knossos at the turn of the 20th century and found the physical reality beneath the story. The Antikythera mechanism was mechanically impossible until it was mechanically analysed. The reality of large-scale ancient astronomical observation was dismissed as fantasy until the alignment of Stonehenge, Newgrange, the pyramids, and dozens of other sites made it undeniable. The pattern is consistent. We assume that ancient people were less capable than us. We file their achievements under myth when they exceed what our assumptions allow, and then archaeology finds the thing, and we revise our assumptions, and the next myth sits waiting for its excavation. Talos sits waiting. Not necessarily as a literal bronze automaton of the exact dimensions and capabilities described in Apollonius of Rhodes. Myth distorts, memory transforms. The story we have may be a magnified, simplified, divinely adorned version of something that was real but smaller, more constrained, less dramatic. But something, some origin, some technical achievement that was remarkable enough to be remembered across centuries and cultures, that was specific enough that the memory preserved hydraulic and structural details, that was tied clearly enough to a real civilization and a real place, that the geography was not lost even as everything else was transformed into legend, something. Act 7. Myth as engineering document. Here is the most unsettling version of the theory. The Greeks who wrote about Talos were not engineers. They were poets, historians, mythographers. They were working with material that had been transmitted to them orally, through generations of storytelling, from sources they did not have direct access to. They shaped it into literary form using the conventions of their time and culture. But embedded in the literary form, certain details survived. Details that resist the easy explanation of pure invention. Details that are too specific, too mechanically coherent, to be accounted for simply by the creative imagination of ancient storytellers. The vein is not the only one. In another ancient account, a fragment from the early mythographer Pherecydes, there is an additional detail about Talos that does not appear in Apollonius. This fragment describes the motion of Talos differently, suggesting not a simple circular walk but a kind of patrol with specific turning points, a defined path. This is the behaviour of an automated system following a programmed route, not the behaviour of a living creature who might vary its patrol organically. In another tradition, referenced but not elaborated in extant texts, Talos is connected to the concept of a law written on bronze tablets, the laws of Minos which Talos was said to carry through the cities of Crete, presenting them to the people. This is an administrative function, a guardian who also serves as a carrier of legal authority, distributing information through a defined circuit, a patrol route with a communication function. This is not how you describe a monster. This is how you describe a tool. And tools are made by makers, and makers have knowledge, and knowledge can be lost. The collapse of the Minoan civilization may have taken that knowledge with it, not into oblivion. The Greeks preserved fragments, distorted through the lens of mythology. The fragments became stories, the stories became literature, the literature became scholarship, and somewhere in the scholarship, in the footnotes about ichor and bronze veins and a giant's ankle, the original knowledge sits encoded, waiting for someone who knows how to read engineering in the language of myth. Act 8. The global pattern. Pull back further now, because the question of Talos is not merely a Greek question or a Cretan question. It is a question about a pattern that appears with uncomfortable regularity across the ancient world. The Hindu epics describe mechanical beings, yantras and yantra purushas, mechanical men with internal systems, animated by principles that the texts describe in terms that are partly spiritual and partly operational. The Ramayana contains references to mechanical birds used for transportation. The Mahabharata contains weapons and devices of such destructive power that modern readers have sometimes proposed they describe advanced technology, including weapons with blast radii and radiation effects that sound, to a post-nuclear ear, disturbingly familiar. In the Jewish mystical tradition, the golem is a being constructed from clay and animated by the inscription of divine names, a created servant, not a born creature. The tradition is medieval in its most famous forms, but its roots reach back into earlier strands of Jewish thought about the creation of life through the mastery of divine language. The golem does not bleed. It does not eat. It functions and stops functioning based on the presence or absence of a controlling mechanism. A word written on its forehead, removed to stop it. The controlling word is, structurally, identical to the bronze plug in the ankle of Talos. It is a switch, a mechanism for starting and stopping a system. In pre-Columbian American traditions, there are accounts of animated stone figures, mechanical birds, devices that perform functions autonomously. The sophistication of these accounts varies, and many can be accounted for as purely mythological. But some share the same internal grammar. A made thing, a controlled thing, a thing that stops when something is removed or changes. The global distribution of this concept, the mechanical being with an internal control mechanism, is worth taking seriously. When an idea appears independently across cultures with no known contact, one of two explanations typically applies. Either the idea is intuitive enough that multiple cultures arrived at it independently, the way that many cultures independently developed the wheel or the arch, or the idea has a common origin, a shared ancestor, a source that spread the concept before the historical record we have access to begins. The concept of the automaton, the mechanical being with an internal animating system and a point of control, may be intuitive enough to have arisen independently multiple times. Human beings observe themselves. They are animated beings with internal systems, and the desire to replicate that animation in constructed objects is natural and ancient. But the specificity of the Talos description, the hydraulic detail, the single vein, the ankle valve, goes beyond the intuitive concept. It sounds like a specific design, and a specific design comes from a specific place. Ast 9. The silence of excavation. Let us talk about what has not been found. The absence of evidence is not the same as the evidence of absence. This is a principle that archaeology constantly demonstrates. The fact that we have not found a large bronze automaton on or beneath Crete does not mean that one does not exist or did not exist. It means we have not found it. What we have found at Minoan sites includes some of the most sophisticated material culture in the ancient world. The storage systems at Knossos, the drainage channels at Akrotiri, on Thera, the Minoan-influenced settlement that was buried under volcanic ash in one of the most spectacular archaeological preservation events in history, the Pompeii of the Bronze Age, the sophisticated frescoes depicting Minoan life, including acrobats leaping over bulls, processions of figures in elaborate dress, maritime scenes of striking naturalism. The administrative tablets in Linear A still undeciphered, their content still unknown. Linear A is significant. We know that Minoan civilization had writing. We know that writing was used for administrative purposes. The record-keeping tablets make this clear. But the bulk of Minoan writing, the literary and technical writing if it existed, has not survived. Papyrus and other organic writing materials do not survive 3,500 years in Mediterranean soil. Stone inscriptions are limited. The clay tablets survive only because they were fired by the destruction events, earthquakes, fires, that ultimately ended the civilization. The technical knowledge of the Minoans, if it was written down, was almost certainly written on materials that have not survived. We are reading the inventory lists of a civilization whose libraries have vanished, and in those vanished libraries, in the texts that no longer exist, in the knowledge that did not survive the collapse, there may have been things that we would find extraordinary. Instructions for building things we have not imagined. Descriptions of techniques that we assume belong to much later periods. Records of achievements that became myths because the knowledge of how they were made was lost. We do not know. We cannot know with certainty until something is found. But the ground beneath Crete is not fully explored. The subsurface of the ancient Minoan world, including the areas of the palace complex at Knossos, the surrounding plain, the coastal sites, contain structures and features that have not been excavated. Remote sensing has identified anomalies that remain unexplained. Restricted access to certain sites, combined with the sheer scale of the unexplored archaeological landscape, means that the question of what lies beneath is genuinely open. If a large metallic structure, not necessarily the mythological 30-foot bronze giant, but a significant engineered metallic object, existed in Minoan Crete, it is not impossible that it survives somewhere underground. Metals corrode but do not vanish. Bronze, under the right conditions, can survive millennia. Buried deeply enough, protected from the most aggressive corroding agents, a large bronze structure might persist, and if it persisted and was found, it would not prove that Talos was a divine automaton. It would not confirm the mythological narrative, but it would require an explanation, and that explanation would force us to revise once again our assumptions about what the ancient world was capable of. Acet 10. The meaning of not knowing. There is a deeper question underneath all of this, and it is worth sitting with before we reach the end. We live in a culture that is deeply invested in the idea of progress, the idea that history moves in one direction, from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to knowledgeable, from limited to capable. This is a useful framework. It is broadly accurate across many domains. Our medicine is better than ancient medicine. Our engineering, on most metrics, is more capable than ancient engineering. Our understanding of the physical universe is incomparably more detailed than anything available to the ancient world. But this framework has a shadow side. When we assume progress, we also assume that the past was simply less than the present, and that assumption can cause us to misread the evidence in front of us. We classify things as myth that might be history. We dismiss details as poetic invention that might be technical record. We file extraordinary ancient achievements under the categories of divine power or religious symbolism because the alternative, that a civilization we consider primitive actually built something we cannot account for, is too disruptive to our narrative. The Antikythera mechanism disrupted the narrative. Troy disrupted the narrative. Göbekli Tepe, a massive, complex stone ceremonial site in southeastern Turkey, built 12,000 years ago, 7,000 years before Stonehenge, by a culture we previously thought was pre-agricultural and incapable of organised large-scale construction, disrupted the narrative profoundly when it was excavated in the 1990s. Every time the narrative is disrupted, we revise, and every revision reveals how much we were underestimating. Talos may be the next disruption, or Talos may remain myth, and the explanation for the specific mechanical details in the ancient texts may turn out to be something simpler that we have not yet identified. But the uncertainty is important. The uncertainty is, in some ways, the point. We do not have all the answers. The ancient world was not simple. The civilizations that rose and fell before our recorded history was even beginning may have known things that were lost so completely that we have only the faintest echoes of them left. Echoes in myth, in architectural detail, in the strange specificity of ancient texts that describe, with engineering precision, things that should not have been possible. Those echoes deserve to be taken seriously, not credulously, not without critical scrutiny, but seriously. Because the cost of dismissing them without investigation is that we might be wrong, and being wrong about the past means being incomplete about ourselves. Act 11. The Craftsman's Legacy. There is one more thread worth pulling before we reach the end of this investigation, and it concerns the nature of knowledge itself, specifically the knowledge of how to build things. Modern civilization has become accustomed to a particular model of how technical knowledge works. We write things down, we publish papers, we file patents, we build educational institutions that transmit knowledge systematically from one generation to the next, using standardized curricula, written documentation, and certified expertise. We have, in other words, built an infrastructure for the preservation of knowledge that we tend to assume is natural, obvious, and inevitable. It is none of these things. For most of human history, technical knowledge was transmitted orally, practically and personally. The craftsman taught the apprentice by demonstration. The builder passed techniques to the next generation not through written manuals but through direct practice, through the physical act of doing the work under guidance. This is not a primitive or inferior system. In many domains it produces practitioners of extraordinary skill, but it has a catastrophic vulnerability. It requires continuity. When the chain of transmission breaks, when the master dies before the apprentice is fully trained, when the workshop is destroyed, when the community that holds the knowledge is scattered or destroyed, the knowledge vanishes, not gradually, instantly. There is no document to recover. There is no archive to consult. The knowledge existed in human hands and human minds, and when those hands and minds are gone, so is the knowledge. The ancient world was full of technical knowledge that existed purely in this form, oral, practical, embodied. The specific techniques for producing Roman concrete, a material so advanced that its formulations were not fully understood until the early 21st century, when researchers at MIT and elsewhere finally analysed its chemistry and discovered mechanisms of self-reinforcement that modern concrete cannot replicate, were almost certainly transmitted in this way. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the concrete recipes went with it, not into a lost library, simply into silence. The same is likely true of the techniques for producing Damascus steel, a metal whose distinctive crystalline structure, visible as flowing patterns in the blade, produced an edge and a strength that modern metallurgy spent centuries failing to replicate. The tradition of Damascus steel production appears to have ended in the 18th century, and the specific reasons remain disputed. But the most likely explanation is simply that the chain of craftsman to apprentice transmission broke, and with it the precise knowledge of the carbon nanotube structures that made the steel extraordinary. Both of these examples involve technical knowledge that was sophisticated enough to be extraordinary, that was maintained for centuries through continuous craft tradition, and that was lost when the tradition was interrupted. The Minoans had 1,700 years of craft tradition, 1,700 years of passing technical knowledge from maker to maker across generations, and their civilization did not simply decline gradually, it collapsed in the space of a few generations under a combination of volcanic catastrophe, seismic activity, and invasion that would have disrupted the very human networks through which technical knowledge was transmitted. What was lost in that collapse is unknown. We know what survived because we have found it. We do not know what did not survive, because absence leaves no artifact. But the known sophistication of Minoan material culture, the hydraulic engineering, the metallurgy, the administrative complexity, the maritime technology, suggests that what was lost may have been substantial. The story of Talos, preserved in Greek mythology, may be one of the few echoes of what was there. Not a perfect record, not an accurate technical document, but a memory distorted by time and the transformation of the knowledge into narrative, of something that the Minoans built and that no one after them could explain or replicate. And so it became a myth. The machine became a giant, the hydraulic system became divine blood, the craftsman who built it became Hephaestus, the technical achievement became a supernatural event, and the civilization that produced it became the homeland of monsters and gods and impossible things, because the people who came after could not account for what they found in the ruins. This is how technical knowledge dies, not with a dramatic moment of destruction, with a quiet severing of the human chain that carried it, with the death of the last person who knew how. And if that knowledge included something as extraordinary as a large-scale automated bronze guardian, or even a device considerably more modest that the myth has amplified into a giant, then its loss would have been exactly as complete as the loss of Roman concrete or Damascus steel, total, traceless, leaving behind only the memory, transformed into story, of something that once worked and no longer does, built by someone whose name is no longer human, but divine. The craftsmen of the ancient world deserve more credit than we give them. They were not simpler than us. They were not less curious or less inventive or less driven to solve technical problems with the materials available to them. They were operating in a world with different constraints and different resources, but the same fundamental human impulse to build things, to make things work, to push the boundaries of what is possible with the materials at hand. Talos, whatever he was the product of that impulse, and somewhere in the long silence between the collapse of Minoan civilization and the present day, the record of what he actually was fell through the cracks of history into myth. Epilogue. The Guardian waits. Somewhere, if the theory holds even a fragment of truth, there is a remnant. Not a bronze giant, perhaps. Not the mythological creature that circled Crete 3 times daily, hurling boulders at the Argonauts and heating its body to a lethal temperature. Myth has a way of scaling things up, of taking real objects and making them divine through the process of retelling across generations. But something, a structure, a mechanism, an artifact so far beyond what the conventional understanding of ancient technology allows that, when it was first encountered by the civilization that remembered it, the only possible explanation was divine craftsmanship. A god made this. Hephaestus, the divine smith, made this, because nothing human could have made this. And when the civilization that made it collapsed, and the knowledge of how it was made collapsed with it, the thing itself may have gone underground, buried under the weight of millennia, under volcanic debris, under earthquake rubble, under the accumulated sediment of 3,500 years of geological time, under the ruins of a palace that was itself built over a palace, that was built over structures we have not yet found. The ground beneath Crete is ancient in a way that defies easy imagination. The island has been inhabited continuously for longer than almost any other place in the European world. Its soil contains layers of civilization stacked on top of each other, each layer burying what came before, each catastrophe preserving in destruction what might otherwise have simply decayed. Somewhere in those layers, the question of Talos waits. Maybe the answer is nothing. Maybe the excavation of every anomaly and every unexplored region of Minoan Crete would reveal nothing more than geology, nothing more than the ordinary products of an extraordinary but ultimately non-mechanical civilization. Maybe the vein in the myth is purely symbolic. Maybe the ankle plug is a narrative device with no technical referent. Maybe Talos is simply a story. But maybe not. Because the ancient world was more capable than we assume, and the things that get labelled myth have a history of turning out to be something more. And the description of a hollow bronze figure with a single sealed internal channel through which an animating fluid flows and then drains is too specific, too mechanically coherent, too precisely analogous to engineering principles that the ancient world demonstrably understood, to dismiss without at least asking the question, what if it was real? What if beneath the olive groves and the archaeological sites and the stone ruins of a civilization that has been gone for 3 millennia, there is something metal, something hollow, something made, something waiting? Because sometimes what we call myth is simply history that no longer has anyone to explain it. And history has a way, eventually, of surfacing, of refusing to stay buried, of pushing back up through the layers of time and assumption and dismissal until someone with the right question in the right place at the right time finally sees it for what it is. Not a story, a machine, silent, patient, real,